The gate slammed shut with a heavy thud, trapping the HOA president behind the bars. I watched, my heart pounding, as the sheriff turned the lock and pocketed the key. "You're under arrest for destruction of private property," he said, his voice cutting through the stunned silence. This was my revenge. A twisted act of justice for what they'd done to my fence. It started with a simple fence. A modest wooden barrier to mark the edge of my property and give my family a little privacy. But from the moment I installed it, the HOA unleashed a relentless campaign of harassment. "That fence has to go," the HOA president, Susan, told me in a condescending tone. "It doesn't meet our community guidelines." I tried reasoning with her, explaining that the fence was well within code and posed no issues. But she was unmovable, her icy glare daring me to defy her. Over the next few weeks, the HOA bombarded me with threats of fines and legal action. They sent letters, made phone calls, and even sent a crew to measure the fence, all in an effort to force me to take it down. I stood my ground, unwilling to cave to their bullying tactics. Then, one morning, I woke up to a horrifying sight. My fence reduced to a pile of splintered wood. Rage bubbled up inside me as I realized the HOA had taken matters into their own hands and destroyed my property. I stormed over to Susan's house, my fists clenched. "You had no right to do this," I shouted, my voice trembling with anger. "This is vandalism, pure and simple." Susan regarded me with a smug expression. "We give you plenty of warnings," she said, her tone dripping with condescension. "Now the fence is gone, and you can install one that actually fits our guidelines." I wanted to strangle her right then and there, but I knew that would only land me in trouble. Instead, I turned and stormed back to my house, my mind racing with a plan for revenge. Over the next few days, I meticulously documented every interaction with the HOA, gathering evidence of their wrongdoing. I contacted the local sheriff's department, determined to seek justice through legal channels. When the sheriff arrived at my door, I laid out the entire sordid tale. "They destroyed my property, and I want them held accountable," I said, my voice laced with determination. The sheriff listened intently, his brow furrowed in concentration. "This is a serious matter," he said finally. "We'll need to investigate further, but if your account checks out, we'll be sure to take appropriate action." As the sheriff left, I felt a glimmer of hope. This was just the beginning of my fight against the HOA's tyranny. I was going to make them pay for what they'd done, even if it was the last thing I ever did. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity as the sheriff's department launched their investigation. They interviewed me, Susan, and several other members of the HOA, carefully piecing together the timeline of events. I provided them with copies of the letters and emails the HOA had sent, as well as photos of the destroyed fence. The sheriff's team meticulously examined the evidence, determined to build a rock-solid case. In the meantime, the HOA had hired a high-powered attorney who immediately began filing motions and objections, trying to discredit the investigation. But the sheriff's department stood firm, undeterred by the HOA's legal maneuverings. "They're really pulling out all the stops to avoid accountability," the sheriff said to me, a hint of frustration in his voice. "But we've got a strong case. We're not going to let them wriggle out of this." I nodded, my jaw set with determination. "I won't rest until they're held responsible for what they've done," I said, my voice laced with steel. As the investigation progressed, the tension in the community palpably increased. The HOA members were on edge, clearly worried about the potential consequences of their actions. They started making veiled threats, warning me to drop this whole thing before things got out of hand. But I refused to be intimidated. I knew I was in the right, and I was willing to see this through to the bitter end. The sheriff's deputies increased their patrols around my neighborhood, and I took additional security precautions, just in case the HOA decided to retaliate. Then, one day, the sheriff called me with a significant development. "We've got enough evidence to make an arrest," he said, his voice grave. The HOA president, Susan, is facing charges for destruction of private property. I felt a surge of vindication wash over me. When can you make the arrest? I asked, my heart racing. We're coordinating with the district attorney's office to schedule the arrest tomorrow morning, the sheriff replied. I want you to be there when we serve the warrant. I'll be there, I said, my voice steady. This is the moment I've been waiting for. As I hung up the phone, I couldn't help but feel a twinge of apprehension. I knew that arresting the HOA president would only be the beginning of a long and arduous legal battle. But for now, I was just grateful that justice was finally being served. The next morning, I arrived at the HOA president's house alongside the sheriff's deputies, my heart pounding with a mixture of anticipation and trepidation. I watched as they knocked on the door and announced their presence, commanding Susan to come out with her hands up. After a brief standoff, the door swung open, and Susan emerged, her face a mask of fury. The deputies quickly handcuffed her and read her the charges, her protests echoing through the quiet neighborhood. This is an outrage, she shouted, her voice shrill. You have no right to arrest me. I'm the HOA president, and I was just enforcing our community guidelines. The sheriff remained unfazed, calmly leading Susan to the waiting patrol car. The law doesn't care about your title, ma'am, he said, his tone even. You're being charged with destruction of private property, and you'll have to answer for your actions in court. As the car pulled away, I couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. Finally, the HOA's reign of terror was coming to an end. But I knew this was just the first step in a long and arduous legal battle. In the days that followed, the HOA went into full damage control mode. They held emergency meetings, rallying the other residents to support Susan and denounce the overreach of the authorities. I received a steady stream of angry phone calls and threatening messages as the HOA members tried to intimidate me into dropping the charges. But I refused to back down. I had documented everything, and I was confident in the strength of the case against Susan. The sheriff's department continued to investigate, uncovering more evidence of the HOA's wrongdoing. Then, just when I thought things couldn't get any worse, I received a startling piece of news. The HOA had placed a padlock on the community gate, effectively barring me and my family from accessing the shared amenities. This is retaliation, pure and simple, the sheriff said, his brow furrowed with concern. We can't allow them to use this as a way to punish you for cooperating with the investigation. Without hesitation, the sheriff dispatched a team to the gate, armed with bolt cutters. Within minutes, the lock was broken, and the gate was swung open. The HOA members who had gathered to defend the gate scattered, their faces etched with shock and outrage. As I watched the sheriff's deputies secure the gate, I couldn't help but feel a sense of triumph. The HOA had tried to bully me into submission, but I had refused to back down. And now, thanks to the unwavering support of the law enforcement, I had regained access to the community resources that were rightfully mine. But I knew this was just the beginning of a long and arduous legal battle. The HOA still had plenty of tricks up their sleeve, and they were determined to do whatever it took to avoid accountability. But I was equally determined to see this through, no matter the cost. In the aftermath of the gate incident, the HOA's tactics became increasingly desperate. They flooded the local media with stories of government overreach and unjust persecution, painting themselves as the victims. They even organized a protest outside the sheriff's office, demanding that the charges against Susan be dropped. But the sheriff's department remained steadfast, refusing to cave to the HOA's pressure. They continued to build their case, gathering more evidence and interviewing additional witnesses. The district attorney's office, too, was determined to see this through, recognizing the importance of holding the HOA accountable for their actions. As the legal proceedings began, the HOA's attorney launched a barrage of motions and objections, trying to delay the trial and undermine the prosecution's case. But the judge, sensing the gravity of the situation, refused to be swayed by their tactics. The evidence against the defendant is overwhelming, the judge declared during a pre-trial hearing. I will not entertain any further attempts to postpone or derail this trial. The HOA's attorney, visibly frustrated, grudgingly agreed to move forward with the proceedings. But it was clear that they were pulling out all the stops to try and win this case. During the trial, the prosecution presented a compelling case, drawing upon the mountain of evidence they had gathered. Witness after witness testified to the HOA's relentless harassment and the destruction of my fence. The sheriff himself took the stand, recounting the events that led to Susan's arrest. The HOA's attorney tried to poke holes in the prosecution's narrative, but their arguments fell flat. The jurors, clearly outraged by the HOA's blatant disregard for the law, listened intently as the case unfolded. As the trial neared its conclusion, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. I sat in the front row, my heart pounding, as the judge prepared to deliver the verdict. The jury has found the defendant, Susan, guilty of destruction of private property, the judge announced, his voice firm. She will be sentenced to 6 months in jail and ordered to pay restitution for the damage she caused. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom as the HOA members sat in stunned silence. Susan, her face flushed with rage, glared at the judge, refusing to accept the verdict. As the deputies moved in to escort her away, she turned to me, her eyes burning with hatred. "This isn't over," she hissed. "You'll pay for this, I swear it." I couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction as I watched her being led away. The HOA's reign of terror had finally come to an end, and justice had been served. But I knew that the battle was far from over. The HOA was not going to go down without a fight. As the dust settled after Susan's conviction, I braced myself for the HOA's inevitable retaliation. I knew they would stop at nothing to punish me for daring to challenge their authority. True to form, the HOA wasted no time in launching a relentless campaign of harassment. They filed a flurry of frivolous lawsuits, claiming that I had violated various community guidelines and demanding hefty fines. They also sent a steady stream of angry letters, filled with veiled threats and accusations. But this time, I was better prepared. I had the full support of the sheriff's department and the district attorney's office, and I was determined to stand my ground. "They're just trying to intimidate you," the sheriff told me, his brow furrowed with concern. "But as long as you keep documenting everything and cooperating with the legal process, we'll be right here to back you up." I nodded, my jaw set with determination. "I'm not going to let them bully me into submission," I said, my voice steady. "I'm in this for the long haul." The HOA's attacks only seemed to intensify as the weeks passed. They began targeting my family, harassing my children at school, and spreading rumors about my wife. It was a relentless campaign of psychological warfare, designed to break my spirit and force me to give in. But I refused to be cowed. I redoubled my efforts, gathering more evidence, and working closely with my legal team to build an even stronger case against the HOA. I knew that if I could just hold out long enough, the truth would prevail. Then, just when I thought things couldn't get any worse, the HOA launched their most audacious attack yet. They filed a lawsuit against me, claiming that I had violated the community's noise ordinance by hosting a disruptive party. "This is ridiculous," I fumed as I reviewed the legal documents. "We haven't had a party in months, and the noise ordinance doesn't even apply to private gatherings." The sheriff's department, however, took the lawsuit seriously. They launched an investigation, interviewing my neighbors and collecting evidence. "They're really pulling out all the stops to try and take you down," the sheriff said, his face etched with concern. "But we're not going to let them get away with this." As the investigation progressed, it became clear that the HOA had fabricated the entire incident. None of my neighbors had reported any disturbances, and the sheriff's team found no evidence to support the HOA's claims. "This is a blatant attempt to harass and intimidate you," the sheriff declared, his voice laced with frustration. "We're going to fight this tooth and nail." I felt a surge of relief, knowing that the authorities were on my side. But I also knew that the HOA was far from finished. They were determined to do whatever it took to break me. As the legal battles with the HOA continued to rage on, I found myself feeling increasingly isolated and exhausted. The constant barrage of lawsuits, threats, and harassment had taken a heavy toll, both physically and emotionally. But I refused to give up. I knew that if I did, the HOA would have won, and they would continue to terrorize not just me, but the entire community. So I dug in, pouring every ounce of my energy into fighting back. The sheriff's department remained a steadfast ally, providing me with regular updates and offering their unwavering support. They were just as determined as I was to ensure that the HOA was held accountable for their actions. "We're not going to let them bully you into submission," the sheriff told me, his voice resolute. "As long as you keep standing up to them, we'll be here to back you up." With the sheriff's support, I was able to secure a temporary restraining order against the HOA, which prohibited them from harassing me or my family. It was a small victory, but it gave me a much-needed respite from the constant stress and anxiety. However, the HOA was not about to go down without a fight. They redoubled their efforts, hiring an army of lawyers and launching a ruthless smear campaign against me in the local media. "This man is nothing but a troublemaker," one of the HOA board members declared in a scathing op-ed. "He's disrupting the peaceful harmony of our community, and he needs to be stopped." I cringed as I read the article, my stomach twisting with a mixture of anger and dread. I knew that the HOA was trying to turn the community against me, and I feared that their tactics might be working. But then, something unexpected happened. My neighbors, the very people the HOA was trying to turn against me, started rallying to my defense. They organized a petition, demanding that the HOA drop their lawsuits and leave me alone. "We've had enough of their heavy-handed tactics," one of my neighbors told the local news. "This isn't about community guidelines anymore. It's about bullying and abuse of power." I was stunned by the outpouring of support, and it gave me a renewed sense of purpose. I knew that I wasn't alone in this fight, and that the community was behind me. With the sheriff's department and my neighbors on my side, I felt a newfound confidence. I was ready to take the fight to the HOA, determined to hold them accountable for their actions and restore peace and harmony to our community. Buoyed by the community's support, I doubled down on my efforts to take down the HOA. I worked closely with my legal team, meticulously building an airtight case against them. The sheriff's department continued to provide invaluable assistance, gathering additional evidence and ensuring that the legal process moved forward without any roadblocks. They were determined to see this through to the end, no matter how long it took. Meanwhile, the HOA's legal tactics became increasingly desperate. They filed motion after motion, trying to delay the proceedings and exhaust my resources. But I refused to be deterred, pouring my heart and soul into the fight. "They're throwing everything they've got at us," my attorney said, her brow furrowed with concern. "But we're staying one step ahead of them. We're going to bury them in evidence." As the case inched closer to trial, the tension in the community reached a fever pitch. The HOA members, sensing that their reign of terror was nearing its end, became increasingly hostile and aggressive. They staged protests outside my home, hurling insults and threats. They even went so far as to tamper with my property, damaging my car and vandalizing my landscaping. But I refused to be cowed. I documented every incident, sharing the evidence with the sheriff's department and my legal team. I knew that the more they escalated their attacks, the more they would solidify their own downfall. Finally, the day of the trial arrived. The courtroom was packed, with a palpable electricity in the air. The HOA had brought in their top-tier legal team, determined to pull out all the stops to win the case. But the prosecution was more than ready. They presented a mountain of evidence, meticulously dismantling the HOA's arguments and exposing their blatant disregard for the law. As the trial wore on, it became increasingly clear that the HOA was fighting a losing battle. Their defense crumbled under the weight of the prosecution's case, and the jury seemed increasingly sympathetic to my cause. In the end, the verdict was a resounding victory. The jury found the HOA guilty on multiple counts, including destruction of private property, harassment, and abuse of power. The judge ordered them to pay hefty fines and make restitution for the damage they had caused. As the HOA members filed out of the courtroom, their heads hung in shame, I couldn't help but feel a sense of triumph. After months of relentless struggle, justice had finally been served. But the real victory, I realized, was the solidarity and support I had found within my community. They had stood by me through thick and thin, refusing to be cowed by the HOA's intimidation tactics. And in the end, that was the true measure of my success. In the aftermath of the trial, the community came together to celebrate the victory over the HOA. Neighbors who had once been divided by the HOA's manipulations now stood united, sharing smiles and laughter as they reclaimed their sense of unity. I felt a deep sense of pride as I watched the transformation unfold. The HOA's reign of terror had not only been defeated in the courtroom, but it had also served to bring the community closer together. "We're not going to let them tear us apart ever again," one of my neighbors said, her voice filled with determination. "This is our home, and we're going to protect it." The sheriff's department, too, took great satisfaction in the outcome of the case. They had worked tirelessly alongside me, and they were proud to have played a role in holding the HOA accountable. This was a hard-fought battle, but it was worth it, the sheriff told me, his hand on my shoulder. "You stood up for what's right, and you've set an example for the entire community." As for the HOA, they were left reeling in the aftermath of their defeat. Their once formidable grip on the community had been shattered, and they knew that they could no longer rely on their intimidation tactics to maintain control. Susan, the former HOA president, was sentenced to a year in jail for her role in the destruction of my fence. The rest of the board members were hit with hefty fines and community service requirements, their once lofty positions reduced to mere shadows of their former selves. With the HOA's power broken, the community began to heal. Neighbors who had once been at odds with one another now found common ground, working together to improve the neighborhood and promote a sense of unity and belonging. As for me, I finally felt a sense of peace and closure. The battle had been long and arduous, but in the end, I had emerged victorious. The fence that had once been the source of so much conflict was now a symbol of my community's resilience and triumph. I knew that the road ahead would not be easy. The HOA would undoubtedly continue to lick their wounds and seek revenge. But with the support of my neighbors and the unwavering commitment of the sheriff's department, I was confident that we could weather any storm. As I stood in my backyard, admiring the newly installed fence, I couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude and optimism. This was my home, and I was determined to protect it, no matter the cost.